Test. Okay, this works. Okay. First of all, thank everyone for just being here. We have a really great turnout for Saturday. I know that this is a holiday weekend, so it's good to just see so many faces in the crowd. So we have a wonderful panel, so I want to thank all of them for being here. I'm going to read a little bit about some of our panelists. So the first one is Lisa Larsen. Lisa is a former small business owner, and she is currently our mayor, so I'm going to refer to her as Mayor Larsen if that's okay during this panel. All right. And she's been on the commission since 2015, so thank you very much for being here, Mayor Larsen. Chris Morrow is a lifelong Democrat and a former city council member and popularly elected mayor in the deep red Gardner, Kansas, which is in Johnson County. In 2016, he ran for state senate. In 2018, he served as Carl Brewer's lieutenant governor running mate. While Chris has always been in favor of marijuana legalization, campaigning statewide with the Brewer ticket solidified his position through his interactions on the trail. With the facts that he was presented. He has been executive director of Kansas NORML since February of this year. Thank you very much for being here. Dr. Nancy Jo Kepple is an assistant professor in the KU School of Social Welfare. She earned her doctorate at the University of California in Los Angeles, where she began studying changes in marijuana policy. She is recognized as an expert on marijuana distribution policy within states that has permitted marijuana use for medical or recreational purposes. She has over 10 years of experience examining the topic in depth, resulting in 10 publications and presentations that address the consequences of shifting marijuana policy and changes in the ways that people obtain marijuana products within the policy context. Caleb Stevens is the chapter leader of Black Lives Matter Lawrence, Kansas, or LFK. He's also a therapist and addiction counselor. He's a PhD student at KU and a power lifter and a burgeoning culinary artist. Jason Dye is a former staff sergeant in the United States Army who participated in Operation Noble Eagle, recovery of the Pentagon, and Operation Iraqi Freedom. He is currently a licensed specialist clinical social worker who works with all eras of veterans and their caregivers. He has his own service-connected injuries, physical and mental. Thank you very much for being here. So without further ado, we'll get started. All right, so I guess I'll ask Dr. Kepple, what are some of the unintended consequences that we may have seen from recreational use that people might not be familiar with?
Okay, so the way I always talk about this or position this is that all policy has unintended consequences, and I think those of you who are more politically active would probably agree with that. As we see, yeah, you can hear me. So I will project. What we've seen in states that have medicalized and then shifted to recreationalizing marijuana use is that the upside is that now people who once were being charged or incarcerated for sales or use are no longer doing that. Although it's not an immediate change, we still see disparities even as that policy transitions. And so the upside is that we see less people being pulled into the criminal justice system. California NORML actually, Kansas NORML in the pamphlet that you guys are passing out cited a study that I had reviewed back in the day that talks about how as we recreationalize, it actually frees up police forces to focus on homicides and other types of more serious violent crimes rather than focusing on actual drug-related charges. And so there's also this benefit, I would say, of reallocating limited resources towards things that a lot of us actually care about more. And so there's I guess the upsides of the uptick that we talk about are the social justice ramifications of really addressing some disproportionality of arrests that we see around drug use, given that actually the predominant population that uses marijuana in our society are white males. And that we get to reallocate our resources towards things that most of us actually really care about investigating and addressing and having more effective police resources in our community. The downside that people talk about is that with the recreationalization and distribution, we see a higher amount of what we call designer products, high THC concentration, so like 35% THC concentration designer hydroponic drugs that are associated with what we call marijuana poisonings. And so in states where we see this, what I call social allowance, we do see an uptake in ER visits for marijuana-related poisonings, particularly accidental poisonings. When we allow not only recreationalization, but also unregulated distribution of the products through dispensaries, then we have an issue which is particularly around this idea of edibles, where we have children accessing things that look like candies, and that's what we're seeing in the hospitals as accidental poisonings, for instance. Because, you know, when gummy bears are sitting on the table and you don't know what's in it, children do like randomly grab things and eat them. And so that was a concern that people had. People also concerned about driving under the influence, particularly what we call naive users, who are people who are new to the use, taking edibles in particular, not understanding the amount of time it takes for it to affect their body and how that impacts driving and so forth. And there's other issues like packaging. So and a lot of the concern is actually less around the marijuana access itself, but more about the ways that people access it. And so the concern is that edibles in particular are not regulated because at a federal level, it's still illegal. So at the state level, they often will allow people to regulate based on state variation. So like states get to have their own laws, and then within that, they often will defer to the counties to be able to determine how they want to distribute it, whether or not they even like consider different policies, and that leads to a lot of confusion.
Thank you very much for that. This next question is for Chris. Your organization is, I believe, pushing for legalized recreational use marijuana, or cannabis, in the state of Kansas. We have seen with the war on drugs previously that a lot of people of color were disproportionately arrested and charged under our drug policies, and now they are the doors shut to them if they wanted to get into that enterprise. What are some of the things that your organization is planning on doing or already doing to make sure that we have equity within the market and allowing people who have done this work, been arrested, they're also going to be able to participate in what's going to be a booming market?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a mouthful. And I want to be mindful of how much time I take. Actually, I could probably sit here and listen to Dr. Kepple all day. Very helpful. But part and parcel of what we're hoping to do is see marijuana legalized in the state. Now, how we get there, whether it's piecemeal, a step at a time, or whether it's the state makes the decision to legalize fully, either way is fine with us. We'd rather get there, the sooner the better. Now, people think, well, once it's legal, your job with Kansas NORML is over, and that's just not the case. There's been a tremendous amount of damage done due to prohibition for the last 82 years. And people have been harmed, and part of the reason that this became such an important issue to me was campaigning with Carl Brewer across the state and hearing stories about people's lives being ruined over simple marijuana use, simple possession charges. It makes it hard for people to get jobs, keep jobs, get security clearances, and put themselves in a position to become registered with a state agency so that they can be involved with future programs, including things like cultivation, distribution, or sales of. And so that's something we're just going to continue to lobby the state on to make sure that not only is this made legal for everybody, but that people that have previous marijuana possession convictions that have otherwise clean records are expunged, In addition, that there's a certain amount of minority type set-asides for people that normally wouldn't be able to, because of financial constraints, to be able to get involved in the industry and help move it forward.
Thank you very much for that. We have a question from the audience. This can be for anyone. What percentage of those who use harder substance, that's in quotations, start out using cannabis?
All right. So I don't know the statistics, and to be quite honest, that was one of my talking points is don't rely on statistics, because you don't know who the source is, what their information, where it comes from. We lie with statistics every day. What I can say is if you take the time to do the research, it's been, the whole gateway drug thing it's just not there. And people who use some harder substances, it's not, well, you know, had I not smoked that one joint, then I wouldn't be addicted to meth right now. You know, so part of what I was going to speak on today, and I'll take this time if that's okay, is just paradigm. For 82 years, it's been criminalized. So there's only a very few small percentage of the population that was alive prior to that, and they were probably too young to really remember what it was like before it was criminalized. So legal doesn't equal right all the time. Illegal doesn't equal wrong all the time. So we have to get over this cognitive dissonance of what we've been programmed to believe our whole lives. We have when I was speaking on behalf of Senate Bill 113, I got a Kansas history book from 1899 from one of my veterans that I work with. And they were teaching racist viewpoint. They didn't think it was racist at the time, you know, manifest destiny, but it was riddled with it. You know, American natives were savages and insignificant. And so this was being taught in our schools. So not only was it being taught by, you know, generation to generation, but also in our schools and in our systems. And so when we had Mexican migration from 1910, from the War of 1910 and so on, and that being their substance of choice, that's really where this all started spiraling out of control. So for the thousands and thousands of years that cannabis has been used and documented as used for multiple different conditions, in 80 years, we as Americans really screwed it up. So statistics I don't think are as important, knowing where someone started, because everyone's situation is different. But I would say that it's no more of a danger, you know, using cannabis versus using a prescription opioid and then going to meth or cocaine or whatever it is to continue that. If you're addicted, or if you have an addictive personality, that's where it's going to lead more from than the substance itself. So that's my viewpoint.
Is that for everybody, or is that?
You can answer.
You know, this is, I'm sitting here kibitzing with Dr. Kepple, and it's like, yes, is marijuana a gateway drug? Well, no, but if you want to consider it, then so is breakfast cereal, or cigarettes, or alcohol, or trauma in your life, or injury to yourself. There are lots of reasons why people move on to more dangerous drugs, but it's been conclusively shown that marijuana is not the reason.
I would kindly disagree that I think statistics are used poorly, and I think it's because they're used out of context. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration conducts a household survey that they systematically do every year to assess what percentages of people use different substances and how. And what we find is that it's a numbers game. A vast majority of our population uses alcohol. A proportion of those people use hard substances, as they call it, or in this case I would call it psychoactive substances. But does that mean alcohol is a gateway drug? No, it's just that a lot of people start with alcohol because it's accessible. Marijuana is more accessible in our society than other types of drugs. We also use it at a higher proportion than other types of psychoactive substances. And so as a result, we see that connection of, oh, they used alcohol, they use marijuana. Yet a vast majority of people who use alcohol don't go on to use other types of illicit substances. Lots of people who use marijuana don't go on to use a lot of different types of substances. And so this is where we make faulty connections based on just the preponderance of people in our society who do things. And so it's about not just hearing the statistics, but also thinking about what it means in context. And the key is that there are lots of people who use certain types of substances that don't go on. What we do know, though, is that for people who do misuse or have non-medical use of prescription opioids, within 10 years, a vast majority of them do move on to use heroin. That's where we see connections. And that type of science is a really good example of where we do see connections over time.
Thank you. And this question is also for anyone. As we transition to medical use, can someone speak to regulation on business and the Kansas worker and any protection, if any, they may have?
There's legislation that exists currently that spells some of this out. There's actually two pieces of medical marijuana legislation that's out there. It's been introduced in both the House and the Senate. Senator Holland's Veterans First Medical Cannabis Act is one, and the other is the Kansas Safe Access Act. Now, I'm not an expert on either of the pieces of legislation, but I'm more familiar than most with it. I can tell you that having lobbied Senator Holland about possibly amending his bill, his position is that he just wants to get a conversation started because he'd like to see cannabis, medical cannabis, legal in Kansas. The Safe Access Act has been around for 8-9 years, and it is a comprehensive piece of legislation. It had grown to more than 100 pages, and it spells out a lot of regulatory provisions, but also protections. And while I'm not well-versed enough to speak to what those are, I know that they exist. I know that people that are in the legislature are concerned about that because it is still a Schedule I narcotic as listed by the DEA. And until that's changed, people are going to have misgivings even if they shouldn't ought to, especially considering the vast majority of states in the United States have access to medical marijuana.
All right. Thank you. This question is also for anyone on the panel, but can anyone speak to like maybe how other industries that benefit from their access, so maybe like the beer and liquor industry or even like medical, pharmaceutical industry, how they have impacted the fight to get cannabis legalizations in multiple states?
Hello. I've only been familiar with how it worked in California. Oftentimes what happens is we will look towards the regulatory policies for those industries to then mimic or mirror those policies as we shift from decriminalization to medicalization to recreationalization. But what's interesting is they kind of stay out of it. I know it sounds weird, but I think it's viewed as a competitive force. But in a lot of the conversations, it's it's a completely different, separate industry, and I haven't seen the other industries helping to facilitate it. Now, whether or not there's background lobbying, I don't know. And whether or not there's background lobbying at the federal level, I don't know, because I think it's important there's only 4 states in the entire United States that have no movement towards any type of marijuana type state level policy, and that's Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, and then Idaho. And so at the fact that 46 out of 50 states, and the District of Columbia also has passed, you know, it's interesting that there's that overwhelming majority of movement, yet there's no federal shift. So I don't know, there might be stuff going on. I think they're viewed as competitors, though, I would say. Is my
I can say that I'm a registered lobbyist. I go to Topeka, I visit the Capitol. I know that there's people that lobby for the vaping industry that have an interest in this. But they're not collaborating at this point. I know there's people in the wine and spirits industry that have an interest in this, but they're not collaborating yet. Pharmaceuticals, big tobacco, there's plenty of people that have an interest in it, but are they willing to collaborate yet? No. Are they making plans to that we won't know until it's too late and they're on their way to big profits? That's more likely.
Thank you. The next question is, very often people hear the word decriminalization and they think that means that it is legalized. Is someone willing to speak on the difference between decriminalization and legalization?
I can talk about what we've done in Lawrence in that regard. I am not a legal scholar, nor am I a lawyer. I'm just a politician. So. Many of you probably already know in Lawrence we took the step to lower the fine in Lawrence to $1 for both the first and second offense. Now the third offense is a felon and we can't do anything about that. And so the reason that we had did this is because part of it is just the trend nationwide, and we're seeing this discussion right here. We listen to the citizens, and I would really want to thank Laura Green. I don't know if she's here, but she really spearheaded getting this to the City Commission, and I really appreciate the work that she's done on it. Now, that is the most we can do as a City Commission to get us towards that road of decriminalization. We cannot do it at this level, but the Commission, our statement, and one of our commissioners even said it, is that we want to send a message to Topeka. And this is our message, is that we're going to take the fine down lower. And for me, it bodes to more of an equitable and reasonable justice. Because our justice system doesn't work, obviously. And so this is, again, another step that we could take to get there to where no matter how much you fine people, are still going to they're still going to smoke marijuana or along that regards. There was a great discussion during the commission on this regarding not just the fine, but also the costs for evaluations, because our previous law had indicated that evaluations potentially had to be a part of that. So we had a pretty healthy discussion, and we were able to get that language changed to where it's optional and at the discretion of the judge, with the presumption that for the first and up to the second one that they would have that option. Again, the key is that the third one we don't have anything to do. And there was also a discussion at the commission, the concern about having the fine for the first and the second violation at $1, that we may be sending a message that that might surprise people if they get the third conviction, all of a sudden they're a felon. And so that was a really good, healthy discussion. It is something to be concerned about, but the commission, from a consensus standpoint, we were able to get just the $1 and the $1, and then obviously the felony. So that's the closest we could get as a city, and I feel like this is a good step in the right direction. But again, it goes back to all this is driven by what we're seeing everybody on this end of the table is doing, and that is they are engaging, And we are watching what other states are doing. And I think it's a good step for Lawrence. So the next step that potentially could come down the line is the way our local ordinance is set up. It's one is the marijuana part. And I should point out that the marijuana, that's for 32 grams or less, which is I think about an ounce. So we're not talking about the big amounts of marijuana. This is all for just local, just a small amount of marijuana. So we need to be careful of that. So the second phase of this may come at some time in the future, and that is the use of paraphernalia, because we have divided this up in our ordinance, so you can still get fines and arrested for having drug paraphernalia, but that's another conversation that may or may not happen here in the future.
Honestly, I think we owe the Lawrence City Commission a round of applause for what they did. But on top of that, it is about the only thing that can be done on the city level, but I can tell you Kansas NORML is going to do that in cities across the state. Now, 2 weeks ago, in addition to Guam legalizing marijuana for personal consumption, New Mexico signed into law a Decriminalization Act, which takes marijuana. It's no longer a felony or misdemeanor penalty for simple possession, but simply a civil infraction, which gets you a ticket and a fine to pay. So that's not something that cities can do at the local level, but Lawrence did this without having to go through a petition process. Wichita in 2015 passed a petition to reduce the penalty. So it's not really decriminalization, it's penalty reduction. And Derek Schmidt and the Republican Party in their wisdom decided to fight the will of the people of Wichita and took it to court and ended up in the Supreme Court and ended up getting overturned on a technicality involving the city clerk. Now, City Council ended up passing an ordinance lowering the penalty in 2017, but not until Kansas City, Missouri passed their own penalty reduction as part of a ballot initiative. In Wichita, in 2015, it passed with 54% of the vote. In 2017, when it passed in Kansas City, Missouri, it passed with 75% of the vote. Probably ought to give everybody a pretty good idea of the direction that this is going.
And this is a follow-up on the previous question. Can you please address the argument that LFK's decriminalization of pot might result in a person being caught off guard on the third no-felony offense?
I might reiterate, it's not decriminalization. We got to be careful about that because it is still a criminal act. And again, that was a discussion that was had at the city commission level, and the concern, as you said, is that would they be caught off guard at that third phase? And that my understanding is that when they go for their first or second time in front of the judge, that is something that the judge would make a strong recommendation, or just to make sure they strongly understood that the third time would be it would turn into a felon. Obviously, our ordinance does not cover that warning, so to speak, but that's just something that would be held, I think, would have to be done at the courthouse.
Thank you. This question is for Caleb. What is BLM-LFK's position on cannabis legalization, and how can we support your group in its efforts?
All right. Well, first of all, I think we should recognize that we're occupying stolen land. And as a legacy of that we're occupying also the suppression and the erasure of stolen information from indigenous and also from Black realities and identities. I think that these are things that are important because the suppression, much like Jason was talking about, and the rest of the people are talking about, is that if we don't know the information, then it doesn't matter what we feel. because nobody's gonna listen to us unless we, number one, usually have a budget. But then, I'm just talking about people in general, not just BLM, LFK, but also because it doesn't really get to the roots of the conversation. So my specialty is trauma. My specialty is also, I'm an addictions counselor, I'm also a therapist. So here's the thing, right? Who wants us to do this? And I can tell you that it's white people that want us to do this. Really, because black folks, brown folks, and indigenous folks are not protected, right? Now that doesn't mean that we don't want to legalize it, and we also want to decriminalize it. And if you're not going to release people that have had lifelong sentences for marijuana use, possession, or selling, and also give those same people like funding, grants, or things like that, because, yo, listen, you all can lie about all you want, but the best business people I know in this whole world are drug dealers. So, I mean, and they're also a lot more honest. So, I mean, if we could just be real honest with that, what it comes down to is the racism that underlies capitalism, right? Because if you can have somebody that you can say, no, I didn't do that. No, that person smokes weed. Like, no, I don't want to hire you because you failed your drug test for marijuana, and you know what the marijuana using people do. The devil's lettuce makes people very violent. That's just not true, right? These things are just not true. But what it does do is it enables people to continue and perpetuate racist and oppressive systems, right? But if we're not going to be honest with it, it's just like the fact of the matter is that white women overwhelmingly elected Trump, right? So, but guess what? So many black people voted. The statistics on black folks voting was astronomical, right? But if we can't be real with that and sit with that discomfort, what you're going to do is have people that are already like treated as criminals and profiled accordingly, trying to go around and support and pass all this legislation, all these rules and stuff like that, that don't actually apply to our protection. And that's unethical. And I think that as a party, the Democratic Party needs to really take a look at who they're protecting and what they're willing to do to protect us. Because you want us to do all kinds of marches and protests and sign petitions, but what are you doing to fund things that are restorative? And what really is restorative justice to you all? Because it's not, the reality is that it's more than not building a jail in Lawrence, right? Like a new jail. It's about not moving the community shelter out by the jail, right? It's about the roots of these things. People don't do heroin because they love heroin. And also, people use the drugs that they use because of access to these drugs, right? Access. As an addictions counselor, the reality is people are more ashamed of their drug use than they are thankful for the coping that it brings to them. And if we can't treat people like people, then what you're asking for is movement on your behalf so it can be taxed and so that we can rebuild all this stuff. And that really is more unethical than you realize. We're here for it if you're here for us. But that's gonna take more movement than just being like, yeah, I like that. The devil's lettuce is pretty cool, actually. I like that stuff. It's more about, hey, how can we do restorative things for people that are already erased and pushed to the margins in more than one way in Lawrence. So what BLM, LFK's stance is, of course, legalize it, of course, decriminalize it, and let our people out, right? But if we can't do all of those things, then we're really not trying to do anything for us. And that's hard to get behind, so.
All right, thank you. I'm going to combine, we've had a lot of questions on the corrections stance. So our state, so I'm going to combine two questions essentially. Our state budget wastes millions of dollars on corrections. And this is in the question, I have to state that. How would legalization help that, and does anyone know the stance from the corrections industry, the state's correction on legalization of cannabis in the state of Kansas?
I mean, I know that these institutions love free labor, free production, so that's my response.
I can't speak for corrections. I know that I've seen a lot of diversity of opinion among corrections officers, and they tend to vary county by county because I find that different local jurisdictions have very different opinions. I I do know though that like all the research has shown that it does save the state money. Like when you aren't pursuing drug-related offenses, particularly at how we do, and you're really just shifting the focus to a different level, it saves the state money in that way. I think the problem that it comes is there's an offset, right? Which is that now we need to shift money and focus to, once we medicalize or recreationalize, you have to shift focus to regulation. So just like alcohol and tobacco are legal substances that we distribute in our society, we have an infrastructure to license them, to regulate them, to distribute them, and so money gets shifted in that direction. So it's kind of like you move the pocket of money to a different place.
I have visited with the ACLU about their Smart Justice Kansas program, and while I left some information at home on my desk this morning, I can tell you that I want to say if the state was to stop 100% imprisoning people for simple possession, it would save the state of Kansas $142 million a year. And Kansas currently, the state, the national average for use of diversion program is 9.1%. In Kansas, it's 4.6%. If we were just to catch up with the national average, if I remember correctly, and please remember, my information's on my desk at home, that would be another $14 or $15 million worth of savings every single year. That's the people that Sam Brownback, for instance, wanted to put in charge of our prison system and building new prisons. They don't want to see that happen. We've got to keep moving forward on defelonizing possession and utilizing diversion.
I think that from a mental health standpoint, people also are dealing with everyday versions of anxiety and depression and things like that. And so they use these things because, number one, they don't require 15 months of waiting in order to get like a mental health evaluation, but they also don't come with the same kind of side effects from big pharma's products that come out, and then things to treat the things, and then things to treat the things with, right? The reality is that if we're looking at this thing from not only just a race standpoint, but also class, we don't have time if we're working 8 to 5 to go to 15 doctor's appointments or things like that. And when you take people's ability to self-regulate away, then what you turn it into is a shame spiral. So how many people in the audience have heard themselves or other people talking about how they just can't believe that somebody would do that drug or something like that? I'm an addictions counselor. I've said that in the past. I'm not proud of it, but the reality is that that's us versus them, right? That you want to be better so you can feel better. But guess what? You might also be shitty as a person. Like, you know what I mean? So, but why just using something to cope make a person a bad person, right? The reality is that, like, I work out a lot, way more than people probably think that I should. And that is my therapy. I cook, that's my therapy. You can overuse anything, right? And the reality is that what you're not talking about is why the hell we are needing to use these things to survive throughout the day. And if we're not going to address that, then we're always going to look at it like, oh, it's money and we just can't do this and can't do that. But you're not looking, this is a public health issue. And we need to get back to treating people like they're whole people instead of shattered fragments of broken effort. Like it's the people that are living with addiction are trying as hard as they're able to, right? There is so much more that goes into being a human being, then, well, you just weren't trying hard enough. If you could just, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you'd be a better person and you'd be successful, right? Again, guess who doesn't tell you that? Drug dealers, but business people do tell you that. So, right? I'm just saying, I'm just here trying to live my best life, trying to tell you the truth, right? So, but that's what it is, right? We always want to go to money, but the reality is that if we tax these things, people wouldn't be getting killed by potholes because we could fix the infrastructure in Lawrence, we could pay for books, we could pay for technology, and I wouldn't hear one damn story about a kid not being able to eat in the Lawrence public school system because they can't pay for their lunch, right? Let's talk about people instead of this money, because Lawrence, y'all have money, y'all just play too much. Stop giving it to Salvation Army that's queer and transphobic as hell, and start giving it to people that are building things that care about people. Y'all don't want this, you don't want this, it's money waste.
Well, I mean, you're right. It's about stigma, and that's when I hear the word decriminalization, that's what I think of as stigma. This 80 years of propaganda that not only is it bad, but the people who use it are bad. Stoner, pothead. You think of the 30-year-old son that's in his mom's basement eating Cheetos and playing video games. Not that there's something wrong with that, but still, seriously, the money portion is important, but the human aspect is the first thing. So getting rid of that stigma that's associated with it, and like Caleb was saying, look at the underlying issue. People aren't addicts just because they tried something. They're addicts because there's something else there. There's a trauma, there's a pain, there's a history. There's something going on that they need that because, we don't have a healthcare system. We have a diagnostic system. That's really what we've got. We got people that can't afford healthcare, that can't even afford the prescriptions. Like Marinol is $7,000 a month, right? Something like that. But I can go over to Joe down the block and I can get, a gram for right? So it's about erasing that stigma, treating people as people first, and working from there, So anyway, that's my piece.
I think one thing I'd like to think about that builds off of this idea is that people use marijuana like people use alcohol. Some people use it a little bit, some people use it moderately, some people use it a lot. A very few percentage shift over to what we would consider a clinical diagnosis for substance use disorder, right? But we don't research marijuana like we research alcohol that brings out all that nuance because it's federally legal. And just for clarification, a Schedule I drug, how the US defines it, which is why is the source of most of this tension, is that A, a drug is considered high potential for abuse, B, not currently accepted medical use and treatment in the US, C, lacks accepted safety for use under medical supervision, which means that several opioids are not considered a Schedule I drug, but marijuana is. So one of the reasons we saw a shift to rescheduling was exactly for the reasons that they're talking about, that there's actual research evidence for medical use. Now, is there evidence for medical use for everything people say they use it for? We don't know, because we can't legitimately research it in the United States right now. What we do know, though, however, is that it's used in palliative care for cancer, which is actually where we got most of the compassion for the rescheduling at the state level. Because people could see loved ones struggling, and it does help stimulate appetite. It does help with chronic pain. It does help with things that are a lot better than sometimes taking an opioid pill. Right now, there's conversations about how people are using marijuana to address chronic pain instead of using opioid medication, given the abuse potential of opioids. And there are several different ways that people are using this, and because of the stigma, there's not space to talk about all that nuance. That maybe actually, if we didn't focus on the felony part of it and took that off the table, then we could start focusing on the small percentage of people who are struggling and having addiction that's associated with different types of drugs, including marijuana, and leaving everybody else alone, per se. So that it's this, when we take the stigma away, we can actually deal with the reality behind the issue.
You know, what he was saying earlier about, you know, if we're not going all the way, that we're not really interested in getting things done. And you know, there's a lot that can happen a little bit at a time, and it's sad that it has to go a little bit at a time, and it's sad that in Kansas we have to worry about, are we going to be last? I tell people every time that I speak that you know, we could be next or we could be last, and some of that relates to penalty reduction at the local level, which we're going to do because it's going to help us build momentum. But medicinally, especially children, elderly folks, people with cancer, veterans, you know, these are the people that really would benefit from, you know, the substance. Not only that, you know, 92% of Americans surveyed, veterans surveyed, were in favor of studying marijuana for medical use more. 83% were in favor of legalizing it for medical use. And there are a number of medical marijuana bills, not just at the state level, but at the federal level. And we've got to keep pushing to get those through as well. Because even if we've got full legalization, when we get full legalization, there's going to be doctors that are going to want to be able to prescribe marijuana for their patients. And that is going to need to be a different conversation than going down to the local shop and buying what you would like for your own, you know, personal use at home. You know, I said all that just to say this is a piecemeal effort in Kansas, sadly, because it needs to be, but everybody needs to try and get behind efforts, whether it's on the municipal level, the state level, or the federal level.
Thank you. And speaking of veterans, many veterans that are dealing with things like PTSD or other trauma injuries they self-medicate with cannabis because they prefer that over the medications that tends to be prescribed by a doctor, regardless of where that doctor is. Can one of you, either you, Chris, who's a veteran, or you, Jason, who's also a veteran, sorry, can you speak on maybe some of how legalizing cannabis would help benefit the veteran community?
So I'm torn here. As a veteran, providing services for veterans, I see how much it benefits anyone. I mean, specifically my clients. I had guys that were on 12 different medications because this one caused this side effect, and then they had to take this one to counteract this side effect, and then they had to take this one to counter this side effect, and they were all screwed up. And they would have to come into an inpatient psychiatric ward and start over again because the doctors were like, well, I don't know what's causing your symptoms. It could be this one, it could be this, it could be your PTSD, it could be your TBI, it could be, and trying to figure out what prescription is causing what. And so the same veteran that gave me that Kansas history book, Vietnam era veteran, took himself off of all of his prescriptions and started using cannabis. And I got to tell you, the difference in his affect, the difference in his temperament, in his understanding, in his insightfulness, was amazing. Just within a few weeks, he went from this angry, grumpy old asshole to honestly, like, to this wise sage that, you know, and it's amazing to watch.